Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Friday, October 10th, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, Letitia James has been indicted, plus Israeli troops begin pulling back from parts of Gaza, and a Texas court stops Robert Roberson's execution for now. New York Attorney General Letitia James has been indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of bank fraud and making false statements to a financial institution. The move comes less than 3 weeks after President Donald Trump publicly called for her to face charges. Justice Department official Lindsay Halligan, a former personal lawyer to Trump who has been leading the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia for nearly 3 weeks, said in a statement that no one is above the law. James said in a statement after the indictment that this is a continuation of the president's desperate weaponization of our justice system. James's office sued Trump civilly in 2022, alleging he fraudulently inflated the value of his assets for years to get better loan deals. This indictment against James comes after charges against another Trump critic, former FBI Director James Comey. A federal grand jury in the same jurisdiction indicted him on charges of lying to Congress and obstructing a congressional proceeding. Comey has declared his innocence and pleaded not guilty. Israeli troops began pulling back from some parts of Gaza earlier today as part of a ceasefire deal with Hamas. The first phase of President Trump's initiative to end the 2-year war in Gaza calls for the release of Israeli hostages in exchange for detained Palestinians and the start of a withdrawal of Israeli troops. The war has deepened Israel's isolation after their killings of some 67,000 Palestinians and a desperate humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Hamas killed some 1,200 people while attacking Israel 2 years ago and took hundreds of hostages. 20 remaining Israeli hostages are still believed to be alive in Gaza, while 26 are presumed dead, and the fate of 2 is unknown. Attorneys for Oregon and Illinois argued in court yesterday that President Trump's recent deployment of National Guard troops was unwarranted. I spoke with USA Today breaking news reporter Michael Loria, who joined me from Chicago. Thanks for hopping back on, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on.
So what did the attorneys for both Illinois and also Oregon argue in court yesterday, and what did we hear from judges?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. So we have these cases playing out in 2 separate states, but the attorneys for both states are making pretty similar arguments around these troop deployments, which is that, they're unnecessary and unlawful because the Trump administration is trying to deploy these troops over the objections of local officials.
All right, so Michael, we know the judge ruled in that direction. What reasoning did we hear from the judge yesterday?
One of the things is that the Trump administration has argued that given the violence that immigration agents have seen, these troop deployments are necessary in order to protect immigration agents trying to enforce an immigration crackdown. However, I think it was pretty striking to see the skepticism on the part of the judge here in Chicago. And I just want to read some of the things that she had said. Basically, she questioned the credibility of the Department of Homeland Security's warnings about the type of danger that their agents were seeing. For instance, federal officials here keep on citing this case of 2 protesters who were arrested with guns as an example of the type of violence that agents are experiencing. However, when they were arrested, they were not actually using the weapons in any way. The guns were found afterwards, and they were lawfully carrying them under the Second Amendment. And then ultimately, judges here in Chicago dismissed the cases.
Well, as for Chicago, that's where you were joining us from, Michael. What's the latest there? Had you been seeing troops move in before the judge's latest action?
Yeah, this is all happening very quickly in Chicago. The judges here have been trying to move in response to the Illinois Attorney General's office because already we've seen troops from Texas deployed to Chicago. We're expecting also troops from Illinois as well as California. Outside of the immigration processing center outside of the city, we have seen some troops from Texas.
Well, outside of Illinois and Oregon, Michael, how else are we seeing these fights play out on the legal front nationwide?
These legal battles are basically heating up right now because a lot of the local officials in Democrat-led cities, such as Portland or over here in Chicago and then over in California, also Washington, D.C., they're trying to fight these troop deployments. And some of the local judges are ruling basically against the Trump administration in these instances. But of course, the Trump administration is appealing, so these fights are ongoing.
Well, on a political level, what are we hearing from local leaders, and how is the Trump administration framing this issue late this week, Michael?
This is interesting because, essentially, right after the ruling in federal court in Chicago, where a judge granted the Illinois Attorney General's request to temporarily bar the deployment of troops. The question remains essentially of whether the Trump administration will abide by these rulings. Here in Chicago, this kept on coming up in court as the judge was essentially saying to the administration's lawyers is that I understand that you don't actually think this order is subject to judicial review. So we'll see in terms of here in Illinois how long it will be before these troops actually withdraw or if they withdraw at all.
All right. Michael Loria covers breaking news for USA Today, joining us again from Chicago. Thanks, Michael.
Of course.
The Trump administration yesterday began airing a video at airports across the country that blames Democrats for a 9-day-old government shutdown that has prompted significant flight delays. Some 13,000 air traffic controllers and 50,000 TSA officers must still turn up for work during the shutdown while not being paid, though they'll get a partial check next week for work performed before the shutdown began. Republican and Democratic leaders both blame the other side for the shutdown. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer said that every day that Republicans refuse to negotiate to end the shutdown, the worse it gets for Americans, and the clearer it becomes who's fighting for them. The video playing at airports, according to Fox News, features Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem saying Democrats in Congress refuse to fund the federal government. And because of this, many of our operations are impacted and most TSA employees are working without pay. You can read more with a link in today's show notes. An appeals court has issued a stay of execution for a man who is set to become the first in the country to be put to death over shaken baby syndrome. I spoke with USA Today senior crime reporter Amanda Lee Myers for the latest. Amanda, thank you so much for joining me on this.
Definitely.
You know, I've talked a lot about this case here in the excerpt, including when I had the lead investigator on. I know you've spoken with him as well. We'll get to that in a bit, but just refresh our listeners on what Robert Robertson was convicted of, if you would.
Yeah, Robert Robertson was convicted of murdering his 2-year-old daughter in 2002 in East Texas. What he said was that he woke up and heard Nikki crying, and he found that she had fallen out of bed. He says he soothed her and then went back to sleep, and then later when he woke up again, he found her not breathing and said her lips had turned blue. So he went to the emergency room, and at the emergency room, the medical professionals there kind of jumped to the conclusion of shaken baby syndrome. And what Robert's lawyers say is that she actually had a number of really grave physical ailments that included pneumonia in both lungs and undiagnosed sepsis. And she was also on prescription opioids that are now completely banned for children for being unsafe.
So Brian Warden, the lead detective in the case, someone that you and I have both spoken with, he said they got it all wrong, Amanda. What is he talking about specifically when he says that?
So he says that, the medical professionals at the hospital never told him about those other conditions. Apparently, Nikki had been ill for some time. He says they jumped to conclusion that it was shaken baby syndrome. And he also said that they made a mistake in kind of assessing Robert's demeanor. Back then, we didn't know as much as we do now about autism, and I don't think they even knew he had autism. And not necessarily showing a lot of emotion is something that has been associated with people who are autistic, but they looked at that perceived lack of emotion as a red flag, and that detective now completely regrets the assumptions he made and the arrest on murder charges in the case. He's actually friends with Robert now, visits him every month in prison. He's apologized.
And just in recent years, Amanda, who else has been fighting on Robertson's behalf?
The fight for Robert Robertson is really unlike anything I've seen on the dozens of executions I've covered. He's gotten support from dozens of Republican lawmakers in Texas. These are conservative lawmakers who believe in the death penalty, but also believe that Robert is innocent. And they have been really fighting to save him. And they did so last year, and then they've been vocal this year, and they've met with him multiple times, really drawing attention to the case. Also, the lead detective we talked about, Brian Wharton, has been vocal about saying, I got this wrong, this isn't right, this needs to be stopped. And then the case has also gotten attention of more nationally known people like John Grisham, the best-selling author. He was a defense attorney at the beginning of his career before he wrote The Client and The Firm, those famous books that were turned into movies. But he's on the Innocence Project in New York, and he became very interested in this case, and he's actually writing a book about it.
Throughout this time, what's the stance been from state officials?
So the state's attorney general's office, they stand behind the conviction. They stand behind the execution. They've been pushing to get this execution scheduled. They really wanted this to move forward, and they maintain that Robert murdered his daughter. They say that it goes beyond shaken baby syndrome, even though that's pretty much what the trial was all about. They describe other injuries on her body and maintain that Robert killed her, and that's something Robert's attorneys vehemently deny, and they flat out say that the Attorney General's office is lying.
So we know the execution was set for next week. This stay changes that. What's next then? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, the execution is off indefinitely. They've sent the case to a lower court for reconsideration, and what they want that lower court to finally do is basically what Robert and his attorneys and whole team have been fighting for a long time, which is hear evidence about shaken baby syndrome in relation to this case. And once they hear that evidence, his attorneys are confident that he will be exonerated.
All right, Amanda Lee Myers, USA Today's senior crime reporter. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much.
You can listen to or watch my conversation from last year with Brian Warden, the lead investigator in Roberson's case, with the link in today's show notes. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. We're produced by Kaylee Monahan, and our executive producer is Laura Beatty. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio, and as always, you can email us at podcasts@usatoday.com. I'm Taylor Wilson. I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.